At the will reading, I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The lawyer cleared his throat, looking over the assembled family with a calmness that made the room feel even colder. My billionaire grandfather, a man whose wealth had built skyscrapers and charitable foundations, had passed away just weeks ago. But no one expected what happened next. My cousins smiled, thinking they were about to inherit millions, and my parents held their heads high. And then the lawyer spoke my name. I froze. To my granddaughter. I leave, nothing but this. He handed me a small, folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Inside was a single, modest painting my grandfather had made decades ago, a sentimental keepsake, but worth no more than a few $100s. Meanwhile, my cousins were suddenly laughing, hugging each other, each one inheriting millions, some even billions. I felt a burning mix of disbelief, anger, and betrayal. How could my grandfather, the man who had always called me his favorite, leave me with almost nothing while the rest of the family was drowning in wealth? I could barely breathe. Before I continue, if you love intense, dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Revenge Unleashed, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single twist of this story. I had grown up under my grandfather's watchful eye. He was a complicated man, distant in public but affectionate in private. He would take me on trips, tell me stories about how he built his fortune from nothing, and teach me lessons about resilience and cunning. But my parents, especially my father, had always been bitter about my grandfather's favoritism. Family gatherings were tense, filled with whispered resentments and pointed remarks. I had learned early on to read between the lines, to understand the subtle ways people expressed jealousy and greed. The betrayal that day was not just about the money. It was about recognition. My grandfather had seen me, valued me, and yet in the end, his final act seemed to shatter that connection, or at least, that's what everyone else thought. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, clutching the painting, my vision blurred by unshed tears. As I walked to my car, I could hear my cousins laughing, talking about their plans to invest, buy yachts, and expand their already luxurious lives. Each step felt like fire against my pride. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the painting. It was small, delicate, and painted with love. It depicted a serene lake at sunset, the water reflecting gold and crimson light. I ran my fingers over the brushstrokes, remembering how my grandfather had taught me to paint when I was 10. And then, a thought struck me. He had given me this not as an insult, but as a challenge. Maybe the inheritance wasn't about money, it was about showing who I truly was. I began to plan. I didn't want petty revenge, not at first. I wanted justice, recognition, and to prove that I could rise above the greed that had consumed my family. I started researching my grandfather's businesses, his investments, and the family trusts. I dug into financial statements, legal filings, even obscure documents that most people would have overlooked. The more I learned, the more I realized how vulnerable my so-called perfect family had made themselves. They had relied on their inheritance, assuming it would come without effort, without accountability. They hadn't considered the one person they had underestimated, you guessed it, me. It started small. I contacted a few business associates of my grandfather, presenting myself as someone interested in investing in legacy projects. I never revealed my identity. I listened, learned, and gained information about the inner workings of his empire. It wasn't just about money, it was about understanding the weaknesses of those around me. My cousins were careless, arrogant, and accustomed to privilege. They made mistakes that anyone with a keen eye could exploit. Then came the day I acted. I had discovered a loophole in one of the family trusts, a clause buried in legalese that gave me the power to claim partial control over one of my grandfather's key companies. If executed correctly, it would not only shift millions into my name but also place me in a position of authority over the entire operation. It required precise timing, cunning, and a little deception, but I had learned from the best. My grandfather had always said, observe first, act second, and never let anyone see the full extent of your hand. I invited my cousins to a family reunion, under the guise of celebrating our grandfather's memory. The room was filled with laughter, warm nostalgia, and subtle tension, just as I had imagined. My cousins bragged about their wealth, their accomplishments, and the ways they were already living the lives they thought they deserved. I smiled politely, hiding the storm brewing in my mind. When the time was right, I presented a surprise announcement. I had secured a seat on the board of one of the largest family companies, with voting power that could influence major decisions. The shock on their faces was priceless. My oldest cousin, who had always flaunted his arrogance, nearly choked on his drink. Another cousin turned pale, realizing that the carefully constructed world they had relied on was no longer stable. I calmly explained the legal maneuver I had executed, citing the obscure clause that had given me this unexpected authority. The room was silent. Then, a mixture of disbelief and anger erupted. Accusations flew, voices rose, and for the first time, the air was filled with my cousin's panic rather than their smug satisfaction. But I wasn't done. I knew that real revenge required more than just power, it required subtle humiliation, a lesson that would be remembered for years. Over the next few weeks, I implemented changes in the company that exposed their incompetence. Projects they had promised to investors collapsed without my intervention. I redistributed resources to those who had worked quietly and diligently for the company for years, rewarding loyalty rather than entitlement. I watched, almost in disbelief myself, as the family that had once mocked me struggled to maintain the lifestyle they had assumed was theirs by birthright. Through it all, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Revenge is never just about anger, it's about reclaiming dignity, asserting control, and proving your worth. My parents were furious at first, but eventually, even they recognized that I had done something remarkable. I wasn't just the granddaughter who had been cheated out of an inheritance, I was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could see through greed and manipulate circumstance to achieve justice. One evening, I sat alone in my grandfather's old study, the same room where he had once taught me to paint. I looked at the painting he had left me and finally understood its true purpose. It wasn't worth a fortune in money, it was priceless in wisdom. He had shown me that intelligence, patience, and cunning could surpass wealth, that character and courage matter far more than the size of a bank account. And somehow, in my own way, I had honored his memory by turning the betrayal into an opportunity to rise, to reclaim respect, and to make my mark. My cousins eventually came to realize that wealth without wisdom is fragile. Their arrogance had blinded them, but they couldn't help but respect the precision and restraint with which I had executed my plans. Some of them still whispered in private, but publicly, they treated me with a cautious respect I had never known. I learned that revenge doesn't always have to be cruel or violent, it can be strategic, clever, and profoundly satisfying in ways that silence mockery and restore balance. Through it all, I kept one principle in mind: never let bitterness consume you. Revenge is not about hatred, it's about reclaiming your power when the world has tried to take it from you. I had been underestimated my entire life, written off as naive or sentimental, and yet, in the end, I had outsmarted everyone. And the lessons I learned, about observation, patience, and human nature, were worth more than any fortune. Looking back now, I realize that the injustice of that reading was a gift in disguise. It forced me to think creatively, to act decisively, and to find the courage to stand alone against those who had assumed they were invincible. Revenge, I discovered, is not a sudden act of rage, it's a slow, deliberate reclamation of your life, your dignity, and your future. And when executed wisely, it can be more satisfying than anyone's inheritance. I kept the painting on my desk, a reminder of where I came from and the lesson my grandfather had imparted. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the sting of betrayal, but now it fuels me, rather than breaking me. I see my cousins in meetings, navigating challenges they never expected, humbled by their earlier assumptions. And I know, deep down, that I have earned something far greater than their fleeting fortune, respect, mastery, and the quiet satisfaction of poetic justice. At the heart of this story is a truth I want everyone watching to remember: life will not always be fair, and people you trust can betray you in ways that seem unimaginable. But you have a choice: sit in the shadow of injustice, or rise above it. Revenge, when guided by intelligence, patience, and purpose, becomes a story of empowerment, not destruction. It's about claiming what is rightfully yours and showing the world that underestimation can be the greatest gift you ever receive. As I close this chapter of my life, I am not filled with anger or bitterness, but with clarity. The world is a place where greed and entitlement can blind even the most fortunate, but cunning, courage, and perseverance can rewrite the narrative. I have learned that revenge is not about hurting others, it's about proving to yourself that you are capable, resilient, and unbreakable. And in that truth, I have found a peace and satisfaction that money could never buy. To everyone watching, reflect on this: we all face moments of betrayal and injustice. How we respond defines us far more than the misdeeds themselves. Stand firm, trust your instincts, and remember that the most powerful form of revenge is often invisible at first, but devastating in its impact. Sometimes, the richest inheritance is not a check, but the lessons we take, the intelligence we cultivate, and the dignity we reclaim. Life will always throw curveballs, family will sometimes disappoint, and the world may seem unfair. But when you act with purpose, patience, and determination, even the deepest betrayal can be transformed into a victory that is as sweet as it is just. Remember, revenge is not about hatred, it's about reclaiming your story, reshaping your future, and showing the world, in your own quiet way, that you are unstoppable.